On the night of March 2nd, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Pucheta sat on his motorcycle on the shoulder of a dusty, unpaved road in a very remote part of rural Argentina. It was around 10 o'clock at night, and the darkness out there was absolute. There were no streetlights, no houses nearby, and no headlights from other cars. On either side of the dirt road were vast, open fields that stretched out for miles, interrupted only by dense patches of low forest and thick bushes. Far off in the background, the jagged silhouettes of mountains rose up against the starry night sky. There was literally nobody around him for miles. This was a region known as La Pampa, an area famous for its beautiful, sweeping landscapes, its traditional cowboy culture, and its deep isolation. Sergio was out here on patrol, but he was not looking for speeding cars or drunk drivers. He was patrolling for poachers. In this part of Argentina, poachers would often sneak out into the protected lands at night to trap or kill wild animals like exotic wild cats, monkeys, and rare birds. These animals could be sold for massive amounts of money on the black market, and Sergio made it his personal mission to protect the local wildlife from these criminals. It had been an exceptionally quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from his years of experience on the force that the later it got, the more likely it was that he would catch someone trying to sneak onto the land. As Sergio slowly rode his motorcycle down the dirt road towards a desolate crossroads that the locals called El Cruce de las Cañas, he caught sight of something in the distance. Up ahead, near the intersection, he saw the faint red glow of taillights. At first, it looked like this vehicle was coming to a complete stop on the shoulder of the road. But then, rather than parking, the driver turned the vehicle off the road entirely and steered it directly into a nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation. This patch of forest was about the size of a football field, and as soon as the vehicle entered the dense brush, its taillights suddenly went black. Sergio's heart immediately began to beat a bit faster. He was certain that this had to be a poacher. He figured the driver must have spotted the headlight of his police motorcycle in the distance, realized a cop was heading their way, and decided to drive off the road to hide in the thick cover of the trees. Sergio twisted the throttle of his motorcycle, speeding up as he raced towards the spot where the vehicle had disappeared. When he reached the edge of the vegetation, he pulled his motorcycle over to the side of the road, kicked down the stand, and killed the engine. Sergio climbed off his bike and stood in the heavy silence of the night. He reached down to his hip, grabbed his police radio, and called into headquarters. He gave the dispatcher his exact location at the crossroads and requested backup, noting that he had spotted a suspicious vehicle hiding in the brush. Then he unholstered his duty weapon. He knew that out here in the middle of nowhere, it would take backup a very long time to arrive, and Sergio had absolutely no intention of letting these poachers slip away in the dark while he waited around. Sergio had a heavy-duty flashlight clipped to his belt, but he decided not to turn it on. He did not want to give away his position to whoever was hiding in the trees. But as he stood there in the pitch blackness, Sergio realized he was having a very difficult time finding where the vehicle had actually entered the brush. He paced along the shoulder of the road, looking for broken branches, crushed bushes, or tire tracks in the soft dirt. But there was nothing. The entire line of trees and vegetation looked completely uniform and totally intact. It looked as though no vehicle had ever driven through there. Sergio stopped pacing and just stood still, listening intently. He figured the poachers could only have driven a short distance into the thick trees before stopping, and he hoped to hear the sound of footsteps, whispers, or car doors closing. But as he stood there in the dark, the only sounds he could hear were the natural noises of the wilderness. He heard the gentle wind rustling through the leaves, the constant chirping and buzzing of crickets and cicadas, the distant hoots of owls, and the long, strange, churning sounds of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew that if he wanted to catch these poachers, he could not just stand on the side of the road all night. He took a deep breath, gripped his handgun tightly in his right hand, stepped off the dirt shoulder, and made his way into the dense trees. He moved quickly but carefully, using his left hand to gently push branches out of his way while keeping his gun raised, constantly scanning the shadows for any sign of movement or light. When Sergio got about 100 feet into the thick trees, he finally saw something. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a faint glint of light in the darkness. For a brief second, he thought it looked like moonlight reflecting off the metallic surface of a car door or a bumper. He smiled to himself, thinking that he had successfully tracked them down and caught them in the act. But as Sergio turned his body to face the source of the reflection, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw in that dark thicket was so jarring, so completely terrifying, that his entire body went rigid. He stood frozen to the spot, unable to take a step back. As he stared, the natural sounds of the forest around him seemed to amplify, growing deafeningly loud. He felt a wave of intense panic build up inside his chest. He wanted to scream out for help, but when he opened his mouth, his throat tightened and absolutely no sound came out. A few minutes later, in a small home not far from the town, an off-duty police officer who was close friends with Sergio was getting ready for bed. He was just about to turn off his bedside lamp when his cell phone began to ring. He picked it up, looked at the screen, and saw that Sergio was calling him. He answered the phone and said hello, expecting to hear his friend talking about his shift. But Sergio did not say hello back. Instead, a voice came through the line that sounded like Sergio, but it was incredibly cold, flat, and completely monotone. The voice simply said, "Come to Las Cañas. You know what to do." Before the off-duty officer could even ask Sergio what he was talking about or what was going on, the line went completely dead. The officer stood there in his bedroom, staring at his phone in confusion. He tried to call Sergio back immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. This was exceptionally odd behavior even for a high-stress job like policing. The officer felt an overwhelming sense of unease, and he decided he needed to call this into headquarters just in case something was wrong. When the off-duty officer got the police dispatcher on the line, the dispatcher immediately interrupted him. The dispatcher explained that they actually already had backup units speeding towards Sergio's location at that very moment. The dispatcher told him that everyone at the station was extremely worried about Sergio. After Sergio's initial radio call, where he gave his location near the crossroads and asked for assistance, dispatch had tried to contact him multiple times to get an update. But every single time they reached out, they were met with complete silence. Sergio was not responding to his radio or his phone. Meanwhile, 3 police cruisers packed with backup officers were racing down the dark rural roads, their headlights cutting through the vast cornfields. They sped towards the remote area near El Cruz de las Cañas. When the lead cruiser finally arrived at the exact spot on the dirt road where Sergio had reported he was, the officers pulled over. They immediately saw Sergio's police motorcycle parked on the shoulder, but Sergio was nowhere to be found. The area was completely deserted. The officers got out of their cars, their boots crunching on the gravel. One of the officers grabbed his radio and tried to hail Sergio again, but once more there was only static. The officers unholstered their flashlights, turned them on, and began to fan out across the road, shining their beams of light into the ditches and the surrounding trees, calling out Sergio's name. After a minute or two of searching, one of the officers noticed a strange cluster of objects lying in the dirt and sand right by the side of the road, not far from the parked motorcycle. At first, the officer did not think much of it, assuming it was just roadside trash. But as he walked closer and shone his flashlight directly onto the pile, he gasped and called out to the other officers to get over here right away. The items in the dirt definitely belonged to Sergio, but the state they were in was highly alarming. Lying in the sand were the completely disassembled, scattered parts of Sergio's police radio and his duty weapon. The gun had been meticulously broken down into its individual components, and the radio had been taken apart as well. With the pieces left lying in a neat pile, this discovery changed everything. What had started as a simple search for a missing officer was now treated as a major crime scene. More backup units and search and rescue teams poured into the area of Las Cañas. The officers teamed up and began a systematic search of the dense vegetation where Sergio had gone. It did not take long for them to find what looked like Sergio's distinct boot prints in the soft dirt, leading away from the side of the road and heading straight into the thick cluster of trees. The search team began to follow the footprints, shining their lights on the ground. But after they had walked about 100 feet into the forest, following the clear line of tracks, they noticed something incredibly strange. The distance between each of Sergio's footprints was getting wider and wider. At first, the officers reasoned that maybe Sergio had spotted something and began to sprint, taking very long, fast strides. But as they continued to follow the tracks through the trees and out into a massive open field on the other side of the forest, the distance between the steps continued to grow at an impossible rate. Soon, the gap from one footprint to the next was 10 feet wide. Then the next gap was 15 feet. Finally, the footprints were spaced an unbelievable 20 feet apart. The officers stopped in their tracks, staring at the ground in disbelief. Even if Sergio had been a world-class athlete, sprinting at absolute maximum speed and leaping through the air with every step, it was physically impossible for a human being to cover that much distance between footsteps. The police officers looked at each other in the dark, a cold feeling of dread settling over them. There was no mistaking the prints. They were perfectly clear, deep impressions of Sergio's service boots in the soil. There were no missing prints in between, and there were no signs of animal tracks or tire marks near them. The officers, who had been talking and coordinating with each other, suddenly fell dead silent. They walked in an uneasy quiet following this bizarre, impossible trail for more than a mile across the open fields and through patches of trees. Eventually, the trail of giant, leaping footprints led the search party directly to the edge of a massive cornfield. And then, without any warning, the footsteps just stopped. The last print was a deep impression of Sergio's right boot, as if he had pushed off the ground with immense force, and then there was nothing. No exit prints, no signs of him turning back, and no tracks leading into the tall stalks of corn. It was as if Sergio had simply vanished into thin air. The search continued throughout the night. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, a heavy, freezing rain began to pour down, turning the dirt fields into thick mud and making the search conditions miserable. But the officers refused to give up, continuing to scour the area for hours. Yet, beyond those impossible footsteps, they found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of Sergio, and strangely, there was no sign of any poachers either. There were no tire tracks from another vehicle, no broken branches, and no evidence of a physical struggle or a fight. It made absolutely no sense. At around 4:30 in the afternoon on March 3, 2006, roughly 18 hours after Sergio had first vanished, a local farmer was walking along the boundary of his property. This farm was located about 12 miles away from the crossroads of Las Cañas. As the farmer looked down the quiet dirt road that bordered his land, he noticed a dark shape sitting on the shoulder. He squinted through the afternoon light to get a better look. The shape appeared to be a man, but he was curled up tightly into a ball, sitting right in the wet mud by the side of the road. This area was incredibly isolated, and it was highly unusual to see anyone walking out here, let alone sitting in the dirt. Curious and concerned, the farmer called out to the man, but he received no response. He began to walk towards the figure. As he got closer, he realized the man was wearing a police uniform. He had his knees pulled all the way up to his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around his legs, and his head was buried deeply in his lap, hiding his face. Weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped pouring rain and the mud all around him was completely soaked, the police officer was entirely dry. His uniform and skin did not have a single drop of water on them. The farmer leaned down, placed a hand gently on the officer's shoulder, and asked if he was okay. The officer did not move, he did not look up, he did not speak, and he did not show any sign that he even knew the farmer was there. He just remained frozen, huddled in a ball. The farmer, deeply unsettled, backed away slowly, pulled out his phone, and called the local police. It did not take long for patrol cars to arrive at the scene. The responding officers immediately identified the man as Sergio Pucheta. But Sergio would not speak to his fellow officers any more than he had spoken to the farmer. He did not appear to have any visible physical injuries, but he was in a state of extreme shock. The officers called for an ambulance and contacted Sergio's police chief, hoping his boss might be able to get through to him. When the police chief arrived at the scene, he walked over to Sergio, knelt down in the mud, and began to speak to him in a calm, soothing voice. After a few minutes, the chief was finally able to coax Sergio to stand up, but Sergio still did not say a word. Instead, he grabbed his chief and pulled him into a desperate, tight hug, and then he completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The chief gently led Sergio over to the newly arrived ambulance, helped him into the back, and sat with him as they drove to the local hospital. The chief stayed by Sergio's side, walking with him into the examination room. Once inside the hospital room, Sergio became highly anxious. He did not want any of the medical staff to touch him. Every time the doctors turned on the bright overhead lights to examine him, Sergio would squint his eyes, grimace in pain, and shield his face. Eventually, the chief was able to calm him down enough so that the nurses could gently remove his uniform and inspect him for injuries. The chief fully expected to see signs of a brutal assault or a kidnapping, but as the doctors completed their physical examination, they were stunned. Sergio did not have a single cut, bruise, or scrape on his body. There were absolutely no signs of a physical struggle. His vitals were completely normal, and despite being missing in the wilderness for 18 hours through a freezing rainstorm, he was not dehydrated, cold, or ill. However, as the medical team went to pull off Sergio's boots and socks, they did find one very bizarre injury. On the soles of both of Sergio's feet, there were strange, painful burns. It looked as though he had been standing barefoot on an incredibly hot metallic surface. Over the next few hours, as the warmth of the hospital room and the safety of his colleagues began to sink in, Sergio finally began to speak. He looked at his chief and the doctors, and in a trembling voice, he told them a story that was so completely wild, it defied belief. Sergio explained that on the previous night, when he had followed the suspected poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain he was looking at the metal of a car. But when he got closer, he realized there was no car at all. Instead, standing in the pitch black of the forest were two glowing, burning red eyes staring directly at him. Sergio said he stood there paralyzed, trying to comprehend what kind of animal or person possessed eyes like that. But before he could react, the eyes began to glide forward, moving closer to him. As they emerged from the shadows, Sergio saw that these were not human, and they were not any animal he had ever seen. The eyes belonged to two distinct creatures. They had incredibly slim, hairless, gray bodies, massive heads, and long skinny fingers that twitched by their sides. Their large dark eyes never blinked. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but his jaw felt locked and no sound came out. That was when he realized he could no longer move his arms or his legs. Suddenly, Sergio felt an intense crushing pressure build up in his abdomen and his back. His spine involuntarily arched backward in a sharp, painful angle. He tried with all his might to fight against the force that was controlling his body, but it was completely useless. It felt as though his bones were about to snap. Still arched backward in this highly unnatural, agonizing position, Sergio's legs began to move on their own. He was forced to march out of the trees and back toward the road, walking backward. As he moved, Sergio watched in absolute horror as his own hand rose up, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his cell phone. His fingers dialed the number of his off-duty friend. When the call connected, Sergio felt his mouth open and a cold, detached, monotone voice that did not feel like his own spoke into the phone, telling his friend to come to Las Cañas because he knew what to do. As soon as the call ended, Sergio's hand dropped the phone. He was then forced to reach down to his holster, draw his duty weapon, and meticulously disassemble it, dropping the pieces into the dirt. He was forced to do the exact same thing with his police radio. All the while, the two gray, red-eyed creatures stood just a few feet away, silently watching him. Once Sergio was completely disarmed, the intense pressure controlling his body suddenly vanished. Realizing he had control of his limbs again, Sergio turned and ran into the open field as fast as he could, but he only managed to take a few steps before he felt a massive, invisible blow strike him from behind. He expected to crash face first into the dirt, but instead he felt his body rise into the air. He was lifted high above the ground, careening through the dark sky for several seconds. Then the invisible force abruptly let go, and Sergio fell back to the earth, somehow landing hard on his feet. Before he could even run, the force gripped him again, lifting him up and hurling him even farther through the air. This terrifying cycle happened over and over again. Sergio realized that these creatures were playing with him, allowing him to think he was escaping, only to pick him up and throw him 20 feet at a time across the fields. This explained the massive, impossible gaps between his footprints. As this was happening, Sergio began to feel an intense, searing heat radiating through the soles of his boots, burning his feet. The last thing Sergio remembered was running blindly through the tall stalks of a cornfield. He looked back over his shoulder and saw only the dark rustling corn, suggesting the creatures had finally left him. He turned back to look ahead, expecting to see the open field, but instead, he was met with a massive, terrifying wall of pure, absolute darkness. There was no sky, no moon, no ground, and no stars. It was a void, and as he stared into that blackness, he felt himself rise into the air one last time. He looked down into the void, and staring back up at him were those two glowing red eyes. After that, Sergio blacked out. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in the mud, 12 miles away, curled in a ball, where the farmer eventually found him. To this day, nobody has ever been able to provide a logical, rational explanation for what happened to Sergio Pucheta that night in the wilderness of La Pampa. The physical evidence of the disassembled gun, the impossible footprints, and the clean, dry uniform in the mud remained completely unexplained. Following the incident, Sergio was so deeply traumatized by his experience that he officially retired from the police force, unable to ever return to patrol. Even now, local residents and police officers who patrol the area of El Cruce de las Cañas report seeing strange glowing lights hovering over the trees in the dead of night. But as strange as Sergio's experience in Argentina was, it is nothing compared to what happened to a young man in rural Cambodia who went searching for a valuable resource in the jungle only to find himself trapped in a location so tight it nearly became his tomb. On the morning of August 4, 2019, a 28-year-old man named Sora walked out of his family farm in a rural province of Cambodia and began heading toward the dense jungle. It was a hot, incredibly humid morning, and the air was thick with the sounds of insects. Sora's goal for the day was to make the long climb up the steep slopes of a nearby mountain known as Chakra Mountain. He was not hiking for leisure. Sora was on a mission to harvest as much bat guano as he could possibly carry. In rural Cambodia, bat guano, which is simply bat droppings, is highly prized as an organic fertilizer. It is incredibly rich in nutrients, and local farmers are willing to pay good money for it. For Sora and his family, harvesting guano was their primary source of income, the business that kept their farm afloat and put food on their table. Sora was not just wandering up Chakra Mountain hoping to stumble upon a cave. He had a very specific destination in mind. He was heading for a cave that he knew was completely packed with bat guano. The reason Sora knew this cave was untouched was because none of the other local guano harvesters would dare go near it. The entrance to this particular cave was notoriously narrow, and the passage inside was incredibly tight, cramped, and highly dangerous. Most harvesters were too large or too claustrophobic to even attempt to climb inside, but Sora was a very slight, wiry man with a very narrow frame. He knew his small size gave him a unique advantage, allowing him to squeeze into places that other men could not, and reap the financial rewards of the untapped guano inside. After hiking for about an hour through the thick jungle brush and climbing the rocky terrain of Chakra Mountain, Sora finally reached the hidden entrance of the cave. The opening was a tiny, jagged square in the rock face, measuring only about 3 feet by 3 feet. It was pitch black inside, and you could not see more than a couple of inches past the entrance. Sora, who was highly experienced, did not hesitate. He knelt down in the dirt, got onto his stomach, and turned on his flashlight. He took his large guano collection bag, which had a long, heavy strap attached to it, and threw the strap over his shoulder so he could drag the bag behind him. Then he began to wiggle his body headfirst into the tiny opening. The cave system inside was a series of extremely narrow stone tunnels that occasionally opened up into slightly larger caverns or pockets. In these pockets, the ceiling would rise just enough for a person to get up onto their hands and knees. These caverns were where the thousands of bats roosted, and consequently where the thick layers of guano accumulated on the stone floor. Sora slowly wiggled his way through the first tight tunnel, his shoulders scraping against the cold, rough rock on either side. He successfully reached the first small cavern. He looked up and saw dozens of bats clinging to the ceiling, their tiny eyes reflecting his flashlight beam. On the floor was a good pile of guano. Sora quickly scooped it up, filled about a pound of it into his bag, and then prepared to move deeper into the cave system. As he began to crawl into the next connecting tunnel, he shone his flashlight ahead. In the distance, where the tunnel opened into the second, much larger cavern, he saw what looked like the rock walls themselves moving and vibrating. But Sora knew it was not the rock moving, it was a massive cloud of bats. The sheer volume of movement meant that this second cavern was a gold mine. It was likely filled with hundreds of pounds of fresh guano. If he could reach it, he could fill his bag to the absolute brim in a matter of minutes, head back down the mountain, and be done with his work for the week. But Sora knew that getting into that second cavern required him to cross a very dangerous obstacle. He had been to this spot before, and he knew that right at the threshold where the narrow tunnel met the second cavern, there was a deep, jagged crack in the stone floor. The crack ran perpendicular to the tunnel, stretching from one solid wall to the other. It was only about 6 inches wide, but if you shone a light down into it, the beam of light simply disappeared into the darkness. It was a seemingly bottomless pit that plunged straight down into the depths of the mountain. Sora had always felt a deep, instinctual dread whenever he had to cross over this crack. It was a primal fear of the dark, endless void beneath him. There was no way to go around it. The only way into the gold mine of guano was to carefully slide his body directly over the open gap. Sora took a deep breath, calmed his racing heart, and began to wiggle forward. He reached the edge of the crack. He kept his eyes focused on the solid rock on the other side, slowly sliding his torso over the empty space. He did it successfully, his upper body landing on the safe floor of the second cavern. But just as he was about to pull his legs and his heavy guano bag across, he felt a sudden, sharp tug on his shoulder. His body was jerked backward. For a second, panic seized him. His mind raced with terrifying thoughts of some creature grabbing him from the dark. He whipped his head around, his flashlight beam swinging wildly across the wet rock walls. He realized with a sigh of relief that nothing was grabbing him. The long strap of his guano bag had simply slipped into the narrow crack and gotten wedged on a sharp piece of stone deep inside the gap. Sora laughed at his own fear, realizing he had just hyped himself up. He grabbed the strap and began to gently wiggle and jimmy it, trying to free the bag from the crevice, but as he was tugging on the strap, his hand slipped. He fumbled his heavy metal flashlight. It slipped from his grip, hit the edge of the rock, and tumbled directly into the narrow 6-inch crack. Sora watched in horror as the flashlight bounced off the rocky walls, its beam of light spinning wildly as it fell deeper and deeper into the darkness. But then the spinning light suddenly stopped. The flashlight had not plunged into the center of the earth. It had gotten wedged between the narrow walls of the crack about 2 feet down. The lens was pointing straight up, casting a bright glowing beam of light up out of the gap. Sora stared at the light. He knew he was in a terrible position. Without his flashlight, he would be completely blind in the absolute darkness of the cave. He would have no way to harvest the guano, and worse, he would have no way to find his way back through the maze of tiny tunnels to the surface. He had to get that flashlight back. He looked down into the narrow, 6-inch gap. The flashlight was tantalizingly close, wedged just 1.5 feet below the surface. He figured if he just turned his body sideways and reached his arm down, he could easily grab it and pull it out. Sora carefully backed his body up, positioning himself right over the crack. He braced his feet on the slippery rock on either side of the gap. He looked down, took a deep breath to steel his nerves against his fear of the void, and reached his right arm deep into the narrow crevice. He stretched his fingers out, but he was just an inch short of the flashlight. He grunted, pushing his body lower. He began to twist and turn his torso, forcing his shoulder and upper chest down into the tight opening to gain those extra couple of inches. Finally, his fingertips brushed against the cold metal of the flashlight. He smiled, wrapping his fingers tightly around the grip. But just as he secured his hold on the light, his boot lost its traction on the wet, slimy rock. Sora's body slipped. Before he could react, his entire narrow frame rotated sideways, aligning perfectly with the 6-inch crack. And with a sickening slide, Sora fell headfirst directly into the narrow gap. Because the crack was so tight, Sora did not fall to the bottom of the pit. Instead, after sliding down several feet, his body became violently wedged between the cold, jagged stone walls. His arms were pinned tightly against his chest, his legs were squeezed together, and his head was pressed hard against the rock. He was completely, utterly trapped. He tried to wiggle to push himself up, but the stone walls held him like a vice. Every time he exhaled, his chest would compress, and he would slide a fraction of an inch deeper, wedging himself even tighter into the rock. That night, Sora did not return home. Back at the family farm, his parents and siblings were not overly concerned. It was not uncommon for Sora to stay out in the jungle for a night or two if he found a particularly rich area of guano, sleeping in temporary shelters. But as the first day turned into the second, and then the third, and there was still no sign of Sora, the family began to panic. This was unlike him. Sora's brother, who was also a slight, wiry man and had often harvested guano with Sora, decided he could not wait any longer. He knew all of Sora's favorite spots on Chakra Mountain, especially the dangerous, narrow cave that everyone else avoided. On the morning of the fourth day, the brother packed a flashlight and headed up the mountain. He hiked through the jungle, reached the tiny 3x3 entrance, and called out Sora's name. There was only silence. The brother got onto his stomach and crawled into the narrow entrance, just as Sora had done days earlier. He navigated the first tight tunnel and entered the first cavern. It was empty. He crawled toward the second tunnel, shining his light ahead. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, he spotted something lying on the floor at the entrance of the second cavern. It was Sora's distinctive guano bag. The brother felt his heart leap into his throat. He began to scream Sora's name into the dark cave. He stopped and listened. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of dripping water. But then, from somewhere very close, he heard an incredibly faint, weak whimpering sound. It sounded like a dying animal, but as he listened closer, he realized it was a human voice. The brother shimmied as fast as he could through the tunnel towards the second cavern. As he reached the edge of the deep, terrifying crack in the floor, the whimpering grew louder. It was coming from directly beneath his knees. The brother took his flashlight, leaned over the edge of the 6-inch gap, and shone the beam of light straight down into the darkness. There, about 10 feet down, wedged tightly in the rock, was Sora. His face was pale, his eyes were sunken, and he was barely conscious. Sora had spent 3 agonizing days suspended in the pitch-black crack. He had no food, no water, and his body was in constant, excruciating pain from the pressure of the stone. He had completely given up hope of ever being rescued. In his darkest moments, as the hours dragged on in the cold dark, he had desperately wished he had a knife on him, so he could end his own life rather than suffer a slow, agonizing death from dehydration. Sora's brother immediately realized he could not pull Sora out on his own. The space was too tight, and any wrong move could cause Sora to slip deeper into the bottomless pit. The brother crawled out of the cave as fast as he could, raced down the mountain, and alerted the local authorities. It took a massive rescue team of over 200 people, including police, military personnel, and specialist cave rescuers, to coordinate the extraction. Because the cave tunnels were so narrow, they could not bring in heavy machinery. Rescuers had to crawl into the cave with small hand tools and slowly, carefully chip away at the solid rock walls surrounding the crack, inch by inch, to widen the gap. Finally, after a grueling 10-hour rescue operation, on the 4th day of Sora's ordeal, rescuers managed to tie a harness around his chest and gently pull him up out of the crack. He was extremely weak, dehydrated, and covered in deep cuts and bruises, but miraculously he had no life-threatening injuries. He was rushed to a hospital where he eventually made a full recovery. While Sora's survival in the dark caves of Cambodia was a miracle, the history of prospecting is filled with stories of men who went into the wilderness seeking riches, only to find themselves consumed by a darkness of a very different kind. In the cold forests of Canada, a legendary discovery of gold led to a chain of madness, murder, and a curse that remains active to this day. In the spring of 1870, a gold prospector named Frank Lemon rode his horse slowly along the rugged, rocky shore of the North Saskatchewan River in the wild, untamed territory of Alberta, Canada. Frank was at the very back of a single file line of about a dozen men. All of these men had been hired by a wealthy, ambitious investor named Lafayette French. French had bankrolled this expensive expedition, sending the men deep into the Canadian wilderness to search for undiscovered, high-yield gold mines. The agreement was simple. If the men found a viable mine, French would fund a full-scale mining operation, and the men who discovered it would receive a massive percentage of the profits, making them incredibly wealthy. When Frank had first signed up for the job back in the city, he had been ecstatic. He viewed this as the opportunity of a lifetime. He had been so convinced of their success that he had persuaded his absolute best friend in the world, a rugged outdoorsman whose nickname was Blackjack, to join the expedition as well. But now, after weeks of riding through the dense, freezing forests, sleeping on the cold ground, and panning in the icy rivers without finding a single speck of gold, the excitement had completely worn off. Frank was exhausted, irritable, and homesick. All he wanted to do was pack up his gear and go home. As the line of riders continued their slow trek along the riverbank, Frank zoned out, letting his horse guide itself while he stared blankly into the thick forest that lined the right side of the path. But as he scanned the dense trees, something caught his eye. Deep in the thick underbrush, almost completely hidden by overgrown branches, there was a tiny, winding dirt trail. For some inexplicable reason, Frank felt an incredibly powerful, sudden pull toward this trail. It was an almost magnetic sensation, an overwhelming feeling that he absolutely had to go down this path. He pulled hard on his horse's reins, bringing the animal to a sudden halt. He sat there on his saddle, completely transfixed, staring at the faint trail as it wound off into the dark depths of the forest. Frank began to think about how they had spent weeks searching the riverbanks and finding nothing. He thought to himself that perhaps the gold was not in the river at all. Maybe the true source of the gold was hidden deep in the woods, and this mysterious, untouched trail was the key to finding it. Frank turned around on his saddle to share his idea with the rest of the expedition. But when he looked ahead, he realized that the line of riders had already moved far down the riverbank. They had not even noticed that Frank had stopped. The only person who had remained behind was his best friend, Blackjack, who had stopped his horse a few yards away and was watching Frank with a puzzled expression. Frank realized he did not care that the rest of the group had left them. He had grown to dislike the other men, and he was completely over Lafayette's rigid schedule. He looked at Blackjack, pointed his finger toward the hidden trail in the brush, and gestured with his head, asking if he wanted to go check it out. Blackjack, who was also thoroughly sick of the fruitless expedition, smiled, nodded his head, and steered his horse alongside Frank's. The two friends turned their horses away from the river and slowly rode into the dark, thick canopy of the forest, following the winding dirt path. For several hours, Frank and Blackjack rode deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The forest around them was incredibly dense, with towering pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a dark, gloomy atmosphere. The trail was narrow, and they had to constantly duck to avoid low-hanging branches. As they rode in silence, Frank began to feel an intense sensation of unease. He kept hearing what sounded like faint, whispering voices and light footsteps rustling in the dry leaves right behind his horse. But every single time he whipped his head around to look, the trail behind him was completely empty. Eventually, the paranoia got the better of him. Frank looked over at Blackjack and asked if he was hearing those strange noises too. Blackjack looked at him, his face serious, and admitted that he had been hearing the exact same whispers and footsteps for the past hour. They both turned to look back down the trail, but there was nothing but shadows. The two men tried to rationalize the sounds. They convinced themselves that the noises must be the rest of their expedition party, who had likely realized they were missing and were now tracking them through the woods. But neither Frank nor Blackjack had any desire to rejoin the group. They decided to pick up the pace and keep moving forward. Suddenly, the narrow dirt path led the two men out into a small clearing where a crystal-clear, fast-flowing stream cut through the forest. The horses were tired and thirsty, so Frank and Blackjack dismounted. They walked down to the edge of the water, knelt down in the gravel, and scooped their metal canteens into the stream. As Frank lowered his canteen, his eyes caught a glint of yellow light reflecting through the water. He froze. He stared down at the shallow bed of the stream, and his jaw dropped. Sitting right there on the gravel, completely undisturbed, were several large, heavy nuggets of solid gold. Frank could barely breathe. He reached out, grabbed Blackjack's arm, and pulled him down toward the water, pointing at the shiny yellow rocks. Blackjack stared in absolute shock. The two men looked at each other, their faces filled with pure, unadulterated joy. They had actually found it. But Frank, trying to keep his composure, told Blackjack that they needed to find the source. They needed to see where this gold was coming from. The two friends began to walk quickly upstream, keeping their eyes glued to the water. As they moved further up the creek, they saw more and more gold nuggets scattered across the bottom. The concentration was unbelievable. Finally, they reached a spot where the stream flowed over a massive vertical rock ledge, forming a small waterfall. Frank and Blackjack stepped closer to the rock face, and what they saw made their heads spin. Embedded directly into the solid rock of the ledge were thick, bulging, glittering veins of pure gold. It was a massive, completely untouched gold mine. It was a deposit so incredibly large that it was easily worth millions, possibly even billions of dollars in today's money. The two men completely lost their minds. They began to jump up and down, screaming, laughing, and hugging each other in the middle of the quiet forest. They were going to be incredibly rich, but after a few minutes of wild celebration, the laughter slowly died down. The two friends stood in the shadow of the golden ledge, and a heavy, tense silence settled over them as they both realized they now faced a massive, terrifying dilemma. They were contractually obligated to report any gold discovery directly to Lafayette French. If they followed the rules, French would swoop in with his massive resources, build a giant mining operation, and claim the vast majority of the wealth for himself. He would hand Frank and Blackjack a nice finder's fee, but it would be a microscopic fraction of what the mine was truly worth. On the other hand, they could keep the discovery a complete secret. They could desert the expedition, return to the city, and then come back to this hidden location on their own. They could slowly, secretly harvest the gold themselves and keep every single penny of the billions of dollars. But this option was incredibly risky. If Lafayette French or the authorities ever found out they had stolen the claim, they would face massive lawsuits, prison time, or worse. Frank looked at Blackjack and suggested that this was far too big of a decision to make on the spot. He proposed that they set up camp right there in the clearing, spend the night sleeping on it, and make their final decision in the morning when they were rested and clear-headed. Blackjack agreed. They walked back to the clearing near the stream. Blackjack grabbed his axe and walked off into the trees to gather firewood, while Frank began to unpack their gear and pitch their small canvas tent. But as Frank worked in the fading light, that same intense feeling of paranoia returned. The forest was dead silent, but Frank kept hearing faint, rhythmic whispers echoing from the trees. It sounded like multiple people standing just out of sight, muttering to each other. He spun around repeatedly, calling out, but there was nobody there. At one point, the whispers sounded so close that Frank felt certain someone was standing right behind him. He spun around, but the clearing was empty. He looked across to the far side of the clearing and saw Blackjack emerging from the trees with a heavy bundle of firewood. It was impossible for Blackjack to have made those sounds. Frank felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He felt an overwhelming sensation that they were being watched by something unseen and malevolent, but he forced himself to ignore it, attributing it to gold fever and exhaustion. A few hours later, the night had set in, and the clearing was pitch black, lit only by the orange glow of their campfire. Frank and Blackjack sat on a fallen log, eating their dried rations in silence. Finally, Frank broke the quiet. He looked at Blackjack and said that they would be absolute fools to tell Lafayette French about the mine. He argued that they had endured all the hardship and they deserved to keep the endless wealth for themselves, but as Frank spoke, he saw Blackjack's face harden. Blackjack shook his head, looked down at the fire, and said that he could not do it. He said that lying and stealing the claim was morally wrong. He had signed a contract, and he intended to keep his word. He told Frank that he would rather be a poor, honest man than a rich, morally bankrupt thief. Frank felt a sudden, hot flash of anger rise up in his chest. He began to argue louder, but Blackjack refused to budge. Within minutes, the discussion escalated into a full-blown, screaming match. The two best friends stood up, standing toe-to-toe in the firelight, yelling insults at each other. Finally, Blackjack, completely fed up, threw his hands in the air and said he was done talking. He turned his back on Frank, stormed over to the tent, crawled inside, and zipped the flap shut. Frank stood by the campfire, his body trembling with rage. He sat back down on the log, staring into the flickering flames, his mind spiraling. He could not believe his best friend was going to ruin this for them. If Blackjack insisted on being honest, he would tell Lafayette French about the mine, and Frank's dream of infinite wealth would be shattered. Frank began to view Blackjack not as his best friend, but as a massive obstacle standing between him and his destiny. As Frank sat there in the dark, the whispers in the trees seemed to grow louder, swirling around his head. A dark, heavy madness seemed to take hold of his mind. He felt as though he was no longer in control of his own actions. He stood up slowly, walked over to the woodpile, and wrapped his hands around the cold wooden handle of Blackjack's camp axe. He walked slowly, silently over to the tent. He pulled back the canvas flap. Inside, Blackjack was lying in his sleeping bag, his back turned, snoring softly. Frank stepped into the tent, raised the heavy axe high above his head, and with a grunt of rage, drove the blade directly into Blackjack's skull, killing him instantly. A few minutes later, Frank was sitting back on the log by the campfire. He looked down at his hands, which were covered in his best friend's blood. The overwhelming rage had suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, sickening horror. He looked toward the dark tent, realizing what he had just done. He had just murdered his absolute best friend in cold blood. He began to weep, wondering what had come over him, but as he sat there sobbing, the sound of a twig snapping violently over by the tent cut through the quiet. Frank froze, his breath catching in his throat. He looked toward the tent from inside the dark canvas structure. A low, guttural, agonizing moaning sound began to echo. It sounded like a man in extreme pain, gasping for air. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. He thought to himself that it was impossible for Blackjack to be alive. The blow from the axe had been catastrophic. He stood up slowly, backing away from the tent. As he backed away, the moaning sound grew louder and it began to move. It sounded as though the source of the sound was slowly crawling out of the tent, dragging itself across the dirt toward Frank. But as Frank stared at the tent's entrance, the flap did not move. There was nothing physical emerging from the tent. Yet, the sound of the agonizing moaning was now standing right in the center of the clearing, just feet away from him. Suddenly, the moaning stopped, and the air around Frank grew freezing cold. The faint whispers in the trees returned, but this time, they were not faint. They were incredibly clear, loud, and echoing from all directions at once. The voices spoke directly to Frank, saying, "You are going to be tortured for what you did to Blackjack." The moment the voices stopped, the forest fell into a dead, terrifying silence. And then, without warning, an incredibly loud, high-pitched, blood-curdling human scream erupted from inside the tent. Frank did not hesitate. He let out a scream of his own, turned, and ran blindly toward his horse. He leaped onto the saddle and kicked the horse into a frantic gallop, racing away from the clearing, away from the gold, and away from his friend's body. As he rode wildly through the dark, dense forest, he could hear the sound of heavy, stomping footsteps and malicious whispering chasing him through the trees, right on his horse's tail. He was too terrified to look back, pushing his horse to its absolute limit. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to break, Frank's horse burst out of the tree line. By absolute chance, he had arrived back at the small frontier settlement where the expedition had originally started. The moment his horse stepped onto the dirt street of the town, the sounds of the whispering and the chasing footsteps instantly vanished. Frank was safe, but Frank was a completely broken man. He had convinced himself that the terrifying sounds in the forest were the vengeful ghost of Blackjack, hunting him for his crime. He did not care about the gold anymore. He was consumed by a primitive spiritual terror. He rode his horse straight to the local church, collapsed onto the front steps, and waited. When the local priest arrived at the church a short time later, he found Frank sitting in a pile of his own sweat and tears, looking absolutely wild-eyed and manic. Frank immediately rushed the priest, grabbed his robes, and began begging the priest to save his soul from Blackjack's ghost. At first, the priest thought Frank was simply a madman who had lost his mind in the wilderness. But as he calmed Frank down and got him to tell his story step by step, the priest realized that the core of the story was likely true. Frank had actually found a massive gold mine, and in a fit of greed, he had murdered his partner. But as the priest listened to the description of the gold, a strange, dark change came over him. Despite the fact that a man had just confessed to a brutal murder, the priest could only focus on one thing: the gold. An overwhelming, unnatural greed seized the priest's heart. He decided he needed to get Frank out of the way so he could claim the mine for himself. The priest told Frank that the church would protect him, but he needed to leave town immediately and never return. The priest promised that he would go out into the forest, find Blackjack's body, and give him a proper Christian burial, which would lay his ghost to rest and stop the haunting. Frank, incredibly grateful, thanked the priest and fled the area, never to be seen again. The very next day, the priest contacted his close friend, an experienced, rugged outdoorsman named John McDougal. The priest told John about the gold mine and asked him to go out into the wilderness, find the campsite, bury the body to cover up the crime, and map the location of the gold. John, lured by the promise of splitting the immense wealth, agreed. After a few hours of searching the dense forest, John successfully located the clearing and the stream. And sure enough, inside the canvas tent, he found the gruesome, decomposing body of Blackjack with the axe still embedded in his skull. John immediately set to work, digging a grave near the edge of the clearing, but as John dug, he began to hear those same whispering voices in the trees. John was a seasoned woodsman who had spent years alone in the wild, but these sounds filled him with an intense instinctual dread. He tried to dig faster, but the whispering grew louder and closer. He quickly dragged Blackjack's body into the shallow grave, covered it with dirt, and rolled several massive, heavy boulders on top of the mound to act as a heavy headstone. Once the burial was complete, John walked down to the stream to inspect the gold. But as he looked into the water, the forest around him erupted with the sound of a loud, high-pitched, mocking laughter. John spun around, but the woods were empty. Terrified, he abandoned his search, ran to his horse, and fled the area. When John returned to the settlement, he and the priest tried to convince themselves that the noises were just wild animals or a trick of the wind. The pull of the gold was simply too strong to ignore. A few days later, John agreed to go back, but this time he brought a large group of heavily armed men with him for protection. The group successfully navigated the narrow trail back to the clearing. But when they arrived, John stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning pale. The clearing was completely changed. The massive, heavy boulders that John had rolled onto Blackjack's grave were completely gone. Not only that, but the blood-soaked canvas tent, the campfire ashes, and every single sign of their previous camp had been entirely erased. It looked as though no human had ever set foot in the clearing. John knew this area was completely isolated, and it was impossible for anyone to have moved those massive rocks and cleared the camp so quickly without leaving tracks. He realized that the legends of a curse were real. Overcome with terror, John and the men fled the forest. John went straight to the local saloon, began drinking heavily to forget the terror, and died of acute alcohol poisoning just 2 days later. Following John's death, a dark chain of catastrophes befell anyone who tried to find the mine. The priest, refusing to give up, went into the forest alone, but a massive, sudden forest fire swept through the region, destroying the trail and forcing him to return empty-handed. Years later, Lafayette French, the original investor, heard rumors of the mine and spent 30 years of his life obsessively searching the wilderness for it. In the winter of 1912, French wrote a letter to his family claiming he had finally located the legendary mine. But that very night, his isolated cabin caught fire under mysterious circumstances, and French burned to death inside before he could reveal the location to anyone. To this day, the legendary Lemon Mine remains lost. Despite countless expeditions by modern prospectors armed with advanced technology, no one has ever been able to find the Golden Ledge again. The wilderness of Alberta has kept its secret, guarded by the restless spirit of a betrayed friend, but while some mysteries are buried deep in the silent forests of the past, others occur in the quiet, mundane setting of modern American suburb, where a sudden act of violence can shatter a family and leave detectives chasing a web of lies. Around noon on January 13, 2015, 43-year-old Anna Moses sat at her desk inside her quiet office at the University of Texas at Dallas. She was working on her computer when she heard the familiar, soft chime of her cell phone inside her purse. Anna knew that she was not supposed to be checking her personal phone during her working hours, but she had a strong feeling she knew exactly who was messaging her. She discreetly slid the phone out of her bag, looked at the screen, and a warm smile spread across her face. It was a text message from her boyfriend, Michael Stodnick. He was writing to confirm that they were still on for their dinner date that evening. Just reading the message gave Anna a pleasant rush of excitement. Michael was a respected business professor at the very same university where Anna worked, and he was the first man she had dated seriously since her painful divorce about 2 years earlier. Anna and Michael had been together for about 6 months now, and even though they were both single parents in their early 40s, this new relationship made Anna feel remarkably young and happy again. Anna quickly typed out a reply, letting Michael know she was absolutely still on for dinner and could not wait to see him. She slid her phone back into her purse and returned to her tasks. Anna was a very busy woman. She held a prestigious position as the Assistant Director of Strategic Planning and Analysis at the university, and on top of her demanding full-time job, she was also a graduate student working hard to earn her master's degree in data analytics. When the clock on her computer screen finally hit 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Anna stood up from her desk, stretched her legs, and headed up the stairs to the administrative offices. She walked down the quiet hallway and knocked softly on a heavy wooden door. The man sitting inside, University Vice Provost Dr. John Wowski, looked up from his paperwork and smiled warmly. He greeted her with his favorite nickname for her, Babuchka, which meant butterfly in Russian. Hearing that word always made Anna feel a wave of comfort and nostalgia for her home country of Russia, where she had grown up. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, and Dr. Wowski handed her a steaming hot cup of tea, just as he did every afternoon. Dr. Wowski was 71 years old, with wild, messy gray hair, large wire-rimmed glasses, and he always carried the strong scent of tobacco. Anna did not particularly care for the smell of smoke in his office, but she valued his friendship immensely. Over the past 2 years, Anna had spent countless hours in this very office, pouring her heart out to the vice provost about her difficult personal life. Dr. Wowski knew things about Anna that she kept hidden from almost everyone else. He knew how difficult her transition to America had been when she first immigrated in 1998 to marry her husband, Bob Moses. Anna and Bob had met in Russia while Bob was traveling as a tourist, and after months of long-distance emails, he had proposed. Bob had been her rock in a foreign country, which made their divorce after 15 years of marriage incredibly devastating for her. That afternoon, Anna and Dr. Wowski's conversation turned to Anna's 20-year-old son, Igor, who was also a student at the university. Anna admitted that she was deeply worried she and her son were growing apart. She explained that over the previous weekend, Igor had driven the 15 miles from his college dorm to her house in Frisco, Texas, to visit her. But he had been incredibly quiet, distant, and moody the entire time. She was terrified he was going through some major crisis that he refused to share with her. Dr. Wowski took a slow sip of his tea, looked at Anna, and reassured her. He told her she was an incredible, loving mother and that she should not worry. He explained that young men at Igor's age often just need their own space to figure things out, and he was certain Igor would open up to her when he was ready. Anna let out a soft sigh, smiled, and told him he was probably right. She finished her tea, gave the elderly doctor a warm hug, and headed back down to her office to finish her shift. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, Anna turned off her office computer, grabbed her coat, and packed up her purse. It was a bitterly cold winter evening, with temperatures hovering near freezing in the low 30s. Anna wrapped 2 thick wool scarves around her neck, waved goodbye to her colleagues, and walked out into the chilly parking garage. She got into her blue Hyundai sedan, started the engine, and merged into the heavy rush hour traffic heading home to Frisco. During the drive, Anna's stomach began to rumble. She realized she was starving, but she knew her dinner date with Michael was not scheduled for another 2 hours. She decided to make a quick stop. She pulled off the highway and drove through the drive-thru of a local Taco Bell, where she purchased a chicken quesadilla. But rather than eating the warm food in her car, Anna placed the bag carefully on the passenger seat. Anna was an incredibly neat person who prided herself on keeping her surroundings spotless, and she absolutely refused to eat inside her car because of the mess. About 15 minutes later, Anna turned her car into her quiet, wealthy suburban neighborhood. She stopped briefly at her curb to grab her mail from the mailbox, rolled her window back up, and pulled her Hyundai into her attached garage. She pressed the remote button, watching the heavy garage door slide shut behind her, sealing out the cold wind. Anna gathered her purse, her mail, and the bag of Taco Bell food. She opened her car door, stepped out onto the concrete floor of the garage, and walked toward the door that led inside her house, excited for her date. But just as she reached her hand out toward the doorknob, she heard a sudden, sharp rustling sound behind her in the dark corner of the garage, followed immediately by a loud, deafening clap. At 7:30 that evening, Michael Stodnick pulled his car into Anna's driveway. He got out, walked up to the front porch, and knocked on the door. He noticed that the house was completely dark, with no lights on inside. He waited, but there was no answer. Michael pulled out his phone and called Anna, but the call went straight to voicemail. Michael thought about using the spare house key Anna had recently given him, but he knew she was extremely diligent about arming her home security system whenever she left, and he did not know the alarm code. He did not want to set off the sirens and cause an embarrassing scene in her quiet neighborhood. He went back to his car, sat in the warmth, and tried calling her several more times, but she never picked up. Michael was incredibly confused and disappointed. Anna had never stood him up before. But he tried to rationalize it, thinking that as a busy mother and graduate student, she might have had an emergency or gotten caught up with work. He decided to drive home and wait for her to call him with an explanation. The next morning, Thursday, January 14th at 9 o'clock, Michael drove back to Anna's house. He had not slept well, having spent the entire night calling and texting her with no response. He had even contacted several of her close friends, but none of them had heard from her either. Michael walked up to her porch and knocked loudly on the door again. When the house remained silent, Michael realized something was terribly wrong. He pulled out his phone and called the Frisco Police Department. He explained the situation to the dispatcher, stating his girlfriend had been missing since the previous afternoon and was not answering her door or her phone. The dispatcher was polite but explained that for this type of situation, protocol required Michael to first contact the campus police at the university where Anna worked, as that was her last known location. Michael hung up, called the UT Dallas campus police, and they promised to look into it immediately. Less than an hour later, Frisco Police Sergeant Jay Rhee received a call from the campus police. They informed him that Anna Moses had not shown up for her scheduled shift that morning, which her coworkers said was unprecedented. They requested that Sergeant Rhee perform a welfare check at her home in Frisco. Sergeant Rhee arrived at Anna's house at 10:50 in the morning. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked tightly. Rhee decided to wait for assistance rather than breaking the door down. At around noon, 2 cars pulled up to the curb. A campus police officer got out of one, and Anna's 20-year-old son, Igor, got out of the other. The university police had located Igor on campus, and he had agreed to drive over with his key and the alarm code. Igor walked up to the porch, unlocked the front door, entered the security code to disable the alarm, and then immediately walked back outside. He told Sergeant Rhee that he would be waiting in his car because he had to get back to campus for a class. Rhee was taken aback by Igor's complete lack of concern or curiosity about his mother, but he had to focus on the task at hand. Sergeant Rhee and the campus officer stepped inside the quiet foyer. They searched the living room, the kitchen, and the upstairs bedrooms, but the house was completely empty. Sergeant Rhee then remembered the garage. He walked over to the door leading from the house to the garage, turned the handle, and pushed it open. He flipped on the overhead light switch, and his breath caught in his throat. Lying flat on her back on the cold concrete floor of the garage was Anna Moses. There was a dark pool of blood surrounding her head, and her mouth was open. Scattered across the floor around her body were several unopened envelopes of mail, an empty Taco Bell wrapper, and her black purse. Sergeant Rhee immediately checked for a pulse, but Anna's body was cold and stiff. She had been dead for hours. Sergeant Rhee and the other officer immediately backed out of the garage, careful not to disturb the crime scene, and closed the door. Rhee called the station to request homicide detectives and crime scene investigators. Then he walked out to the curb where Igor was sitting in his car. Rhee tapped on the window and Igor rolled it down. Rhee took a deep breath, looked the young man in the eye, and told him that his mother was dead and it appeared she had been murdered. Rhee watched Igor's face closely, expecting a sudden outburst of grief, but Igor's expression remained completely flat. He did not cry and his voice did not tremble. He simply looked at the sergeant and asked, "Is she in one piece?" Sergeant Rhee was completely stunned by the bizarre question. He replied that yes, she was. Igor simply nodded, rolled his window back up, started his engine, and drove away, stating again that he had to get to class. Rhee stood on the curb, his mind reeling at the young man's chilling indifference. Within the hour, Frisco Police Detective Brian Schutte and Texas Ranger Ruben Mannon arrived at the scene. Schutte was a young, newly promoted detective, and this was not just his first time leading a homicide case, it was the first homicide scene he had ever walked onto in his entire career. He felt a wave of anxiety, but he forced himself to focus. The detectives inspected the garage. They noted that Anna's body was still wrapped in her winter coat and 2 scarves. She had a clear bullet wound in her neck and several in her chest. Lying in the dust on the floor were several brass bullet casings, which the investigators identified as coming from a small .22 caliber firearm. Ranger Mannon pointed out a major detail. Anna's blue Hyundai sedan was completely missing from the garage. It appeared the killer had fled in her vehicle. But Detective Schutte noted that Anna's purse was lying right next to her, and when he opened it, her wallet was inside, containing $300 in cash. If this was a robbery, it was highly unusual for a thief to leave cash behind and only take a common sedan. It felt much more personal. That afternoon, Detective Schutte sat across from Igor in an interview room at the police station. Igor looked perfectly calm. Schutte asked him to describe his relationship with his mother. Igor explained that they had always been very close, and his mother had supported his dream of playing in a Christian rock band. He said he visited her every weekend, and she would cook and do his laundry for him. Igor also spoke about his father, Bob Moses. He explained that Bob was not his biological father, but Bob had adopted him when he was 4 years old after his mother immigrated from Russia. Igor became emotional as he described how Bob had supported him through a terrifying battle with childhood bone cancer when he was 8. Igor stated that his parents' divorce had been incredibly hard on him, but he still loved them both. When Shuti asked if there was anyone who would want to hurt his mother, Igor said no. Then he looked at the detective and said that whoever killed his mother should be forgiven, because as a devout Christian, he believed in mercy. Shuti found the statement highly disturbing given the circumstances, but he had to remain objective. He asked Igor for his alibi, and Igor stated he had been in a college class from 5:30 to 9:45 on the evening of the 13th, which his classmates and professor could easily verify. Later that evening, Ranger Manin briefed Shuti on his preliminary investigation. Manin had obtained security camera footage from the university parking garage, local toll roads, and a nearby elementary school. Based on the footage, they could prove Anna had arrived home at approximately 5:50 in the evening on January 13th, and she was likely killed within minutes of stepping out of her car. Shuti also reviewed the newly arrived autopsy report. The medical examiner confirmed Anna had been shot 6 times at close range with a .22 caliber gun. The shots were tightly grouped in her chest and neck, suggesting the shooter was comfortable handling firearms. But there was one stomach-churning detail in the report. The empty Taco Bell wrapper found next to Anna's body proved she had brought the quesadilla home. But when the medical examiner opened her stomach, there was absolutely no trace of Mexican food inside. She had not eaten for hours before her death. This meant that after shooting Anna 6 times, the killer had calmly picked up her warm chicken quesadilla from the garage floor, sat next to her dead body, ate the entire meal, and threw the wrapper onto the floor before stealing her car. Shortly before midnight, Detective Shuti and Ranger Manin knocked on the door of a house in Frisco where Anna's ex-husband, Bob Moses, was renting a room. Bob answered the door in his pajamas, looking tired. When Shuti informed him that Anna had been murdered, Bob's face went pale, and his very first question was to ask if his son Igor was safe. Bob agreed to go to the station for an interview. He told detectives that on the night of the murder, he had been at home watching television until 7 o'clock, and then he had gone out to grab a solo dinner. He admitted that he owned 5 firearms, 3 of which were .22 caliber guns, and he voluntarily agreed to hand them over for ballistics testing. He also willingly provided a DNA swab. Just as Bob left the station, Shuti's phone rang. A patrol officer reported that they had just located Anna's stolen blue Hyundai parked on a dark residential street just a few blocks away from her house. And the officer noted there was visible blood inside the vehicle. The next morning, Shuti went to the crime lab to inspect the vehicle. A forensic technician pointed out that the car was incredibly clean, but there were 2 small, distinct blood smears. One on the fabric of the driver's seat and another on the plastic center console. There was also an empty Red Bull can and a cigarette butt on the floorboards. Shuti had all of these items rushed to the lab for DNA profiling. Over the next few days, Shuti and Manin began interviewing Anna's friends and coworkers, and they quickly realized Anna had a very complex personal life. Her friends pointed them toward a man named Jerry Caspel, a local poet. When Jerry came in for an interview, he was incredibly dramatic, weeping openly. He claimed that Anna was his artistic muse, and they shared a deep spiritual, non-physical bond. He had even dedicated his poetry books to her. But Shuti noted that Jerry had a solid alibi. Toll road records proved he was miles away at the time of the murder. Furthermore, his .22 caliber gun did not match the ballistics from the crime scene. Next, detectives interviewed University Vice Provost Dr. John Wowski. The elderly administrator shocked detectives by admitting that he and Anna had once engaged in a brief secret sexual affair during her divorce. He claimed Anna had wanted a long-term relationship, but he had ended it due to their massive age difference. He admitted he had wired her over $46,000 in gifts over the past 2 years. Shuti wondered if Anna had been blackmailing the wealthy administrator. But Dr. Wowski had a rock-solid alibi. His vehicle had been captured on toll road cameras far away from Frisco at 5:50 on the night of the murder. He also voluntarily provided a DNA sample and denied any involvement. Frustrated, Detective Shuti decided to obtain a search warrant to perform a more thorough search of Anna's home. When he arrived at the house, he was surprised to find Bob and Igor living there together. Bob explained they had moved in to grieve in private. Shuti began searching Anna's home office. In her desk, he found a copy of a massive $750,000 life insurance policy. The sole beneficiary was her son, Igor. This gave Igor a massive financial motive, but his alibi for the night of the murder remained completely airtight. Then, Shuti pried open a locked drawer in Anna's desk. Inside, he found a handwritten letter, written mostly in Russian. He seized the letter and sent it to the FBI for translation. A week later, the translated letter arrived on Shuti's desk, and the entire mystery fell into place. The letter was written by Anna to her divorce lawyer in 2013. In it, Anna detailed a terrifying pattern of abuse and harassment by her husband, Bob. She wrote that Bob had threatened to commit suicide and leave a note framing Anna for his death just so their son, Igor, would grow to hate her. Anna also wrote that she was terrified Bob was going to murder her. Anna's friends later confirmed that Anna had once called them crying from a locked closet, terrified that Bob was going to break the door down and kill her. Anna had hidden this terror from Igor because she did not want to destroy the only father figure her son had ever known. Then, the DNA results came back from the lab. The DNA on the Red Bull can and the cigarette butt did not match any of their suspects, suggesting they were likely trash that had been in the car prior to the theft. But the blood found on the driver's seat and the center console was a perfect, undeniable match for Bob Moses. Based on this evidence, detectives reconstructed the crime. On the evening of January 13th, Bob Moses used his knowledge of the home to slip into the garage. He waited in the dark with a .22 caliber rifle. When Anna got out of her car, he shot her 6 times. In a bizarre display of pure psychopathy, he ate her chicken quesadilla over her body, took her keys, and drove her car away, accidentally cutting his hand in the process and leaving his blood on the seat. On February 26, 2015, Detective Schutte arrested Bob Moses and charged him with capital murder. At his trial, Bob's defense tried to argue the blood could have been left there during a previous drive, but the prosecution proved Bob had not been allowed near her car since the divorce. In the end, the jury found Bob Moses guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But while the justice system in Texas was able to successfully piece together the physical evidence to solve Anna's murder, other cases involve deaths so bizarre and tragic that the true horror is only realized months after the victim has disappeared. In Taiwan, a young man became so consumed by a terrifying delusion that he constructed his own high-tech hiding place, only for it to become his final resting place. On the evening of February 1, 2009, a 32-year-old man named Lu Jinfa stood in the narrow doorway of his small apartment in a crowded residential district of Taiwan. He stood in silence, his head bowed, as his landlord stood in the hallway, loudly lecturing him about his failure to pay his rent on time. Luo had only moved into this apartment 2 months earlier, in December of 2008, and it was a very unpleasant place to live. It was a cramped, dark, basement-level unit with absolutely no air conditioning. In the humid, stifling heat of Taiwan, the apartment was constantly sweaty, damp, and smelled of mildew. But Luo was unemployed, had very little money, and knew this was the only place he could afford. As the landlord continued to scream at him, threatening to evict him immediately and lock him out of the building if he did not pay his overdue rent plus interest, Luo remained completely quiet. He was not listening to the landlord's financial threats. Instead, he was waiting for a single moment of silence so he could ask his landlord a highly unusual, disturbing question. Finally, the landlord stopped yelling to write down some numbers on a notepad. Luo saw his chance, leaned forward, and asked in a quiet, trembling voice if the landlord knew if anyone had ever been brutally murdered inside this specific apartment. The landlord stopped writing. He stared at Luo in absolute disbelief and annoyance, assuming Luo was trying to make up a bizarre excuse to get out of paying his rent. The landlord scoffed, told Luo he was a freak, and warned him that he would be back in exactly 1 month, and if the rent was not paid, he would be thrown onto the street. The landlord turned and walked away, leaving Luo's question completely unanswered. Luo slowly closed his door and locked it. He was deeply stressed about the money, but he was far more terrified of his own living space. Over the past 2 months, Luo had become completely convinced that his dark basement apartment was haunted by an aggressive, malevolent spirit. Every single night, as he lay in the dark, he would hear the heavy, rhythmic sound of footsteps pacing back and forth on the ceiling directly above him. He knew for a fact that the room above him was an empty utility closet that nobody had access to, making the footsteps impossible. Luo also claimed to have seen dark, tall, shadowy figures standing in the corners of his room watching him sleep. Luo suffered from severe mental health issues and was known to use illegal drugs, which likely fueled his intense paranoia, but to him, the terror was absolutely real. He felt as though he was living in a nightmare. To protect himself from these spirits, Luo began to engage in bizarre, ritualistic behavior. He purchased dozens of traditional Taoist prayer papers, which were bright yellow and red sheets of paper designed to ward off evil spirits. He wrote frantic prayers on them, and then, using sharp kitchen knives, he stabbed the papers directly into the drywall all over his apartment, pinning them to the walls, but his ultimate protection method was much more extreme. Luo had a massive, heavy-duty commercial chest freezer sitting in his living room. He realized that the thick, insulated metal walls of the freezer were completely soundproof and blockaded from the outside world. He began to use the freezer as his bedroom. Every night, when the paranoia became too much to bear, Luo would climb inside the freezer, lie down on his back, and pull the heavy lid shut over him. Because the freezer was completely airtight, Luo was smart enough to use a small wooden block to prop the lid open just a fraction of an inch, allowing a constant stream of fresh air to enter so he could breathe. 1 month later, on March 2, 2009, the landlord realized he still had not received any rent from Luo. He tried calling Luo's cell phone all day, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Annoyed, the landlord walked down to the basement apartment and knocked loudly on the door. When there was no response, he used his master key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The apartment was in a state of absolute, shocking chaos. The furniture had been dragged into the center of the room and stacked in strange defensive barriers. There were dozens of empty liquor and beer bottles littering the floor, and the walls were covered in the yellow and red prayer papers, each one pinned to the drywall with a long, glittering kitchen knife. Sitting right in the middle of the living room was the massive chest freezer. The landlord was completely disgusted. He assumed Luo had suffered a drug-fueled breakdown, trashed the apartment, and fled the city to avoid paying his rent. The landlord did not bother to clean the mess or inspect the freezer. He simply walked out, went to the hardware store, purchased a heavy-duty new padlock, and locked the apartment door from the outside, determined to evict Luo legally and keep him out. For 7 long months, the dark basement apartment sat completely silent and untouched. On October 18, 2009, the landlord's brother approached the landlord and asked if he could rent out the basement apartment, as he needed a cheap place to live. The landlord agreed, but told his brother they would have to clean out all the trash and junk that the previous tenant, Luo, had left behind. The two brothers met at the apartment that afternoon. They spent hours packing Luo's old clothes, his trash, and his junk into cardboard boxes. They dragged the heavy furniture out to their truck. Finally, they came to the massive chest freezer sitting in the living room. The freezer was incredibly heavy and felt completely solid, but the brothers assumed it was just full of old, spoiled food. They did not open the lid, wanting to avoid the smell of rotten food. They used heavy straps to secure the freezer, loaded it onto the back of their flatbed truck along with the rest of the junk, and drove to a local commercial recycling facility. They dropped off the freezer and the other metal items, sold them for scrap value, and drove away, glad to finally be rid of Luo's memory. Later that afternoon, a worker at the recycling facility was preparing to process the scrap metal. He walked over to the massive chest freezer, grabbed the handle, and pulled the heavy lid open. To ensure there was no hazardous material inside before throwing it into the industrial shredder, the worker took one look inside, let out a scream, and immediately ran to call the police. Lying inside the freezer was the badly decomposed body of Lu Jinfa. Detectives quickly pieced together the tragic, horrifying reality of Luo's final hours. On the night of March 1, 2009, Luo had become incredibly intoxicated on alcohol and drugs, his paranoia reaching an absolute peak. Terrified of the ghosts in his apartment, he had scrambled inside his chest freezer for safety. He lay down on his back and pulled the heavy lid shut, but in his extreme state of drunkenness, Luo had made a fatal, tragic mistake. He had forgotten to place the wooden block in the seal of the lid. The heavy door closed completely, and because the commercial freezer had an automatic latch, it locked him inside. The space was completely airtight and soundproof. As Luo fell into a deep, drunken sleep, he slowly, silently consumed all the oxygen inside the small space, suffocating to death within a matter of hours. His body had remained perfectly preserved in the sealed airtight container for 7 months, sitting right in the center of the apartment while the landlord changed the locks and walked past the door every day. It was a tragic, lonely end to a young man who was simply trying to escape the demons in his own mind. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.